Right now, every company in the world is facing the same problem. Their teams are getting buried in more information than ever, and there's never enough time to get through it.
Only 5% of staff make it past the first few lines of any internal update.
So when crucial details are truly needed, to spur growth or make critical decisions, they're often 10 days back in an overlooked email or lost in a long winding thread. In short, the team stalled on progress, and you're left to answer all the same questions again. Axios can put an end to lost time. We know that clear, efficient communication is the lifeblood of any company, and we've nailed the most effective way to break through the noise and keep readers hooked in a tool we call Axios HQ.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Jim VandeHei. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Axios, and we're here to talk about this wild shift in the power dynamic between employer and employee, what we call the big idea of the Great Resignation, this trend that you see unfolding across the country and in your own workplace, where employees just have a lot more choices of where they're going to work physically and the company that they're going to work for. We're going to unpack this dynamic and hopefully equip you with things to know and in terms of how you navigate this trend. We have a cool lineup of panelists who have expertise in this area, people that we at Axios have relied on in the past, whose wisdom we want to bring to you. Jon Clifton, who's a global managing partner at Gallup, who will help us understand what's driving this shift. He's an expert in polling data. We have Lisa Osborne, the CEO of Edelman US, where she both leads an organization but also advises organizations on how to communicate and how to navigate this moment. And finally, we have Brad Burns at Salesforce, the CCO, who will share strategies for driving engagement and retention at his organization. To kick off the conversation, I'm pleased to be joined by Jon Clifton, Global Managing Partner at Gallup. Jon, thanks for joining us.
Jim, thank you for having me.
So you spend your days marinating in data. Gallup's been collecting data since the late 1930s. I think the way to ground this conversation is to think about data and what we're seeing in terms of what employers and employees think and want in what is a pretty wild moment, I think, for all of us. What does the data tell us?
Yeah, so this conversation around the Great Resignation is fascinating to a lot of people, precisely because when we look at this concept of employee engagement, which effectively means people's emotional attachment to their work, right now we see that employee engagement is the highest that we've ever seen it in the history of our tracking in terms of, again, how people feel about their work. In 2000, when we first started quantifying it, 26% of people were engaged. And today that number is 36, which is actually a slight increase even before the pandemic.
Why is that? I think that's a little surprising. I think a lot of people assume that given the rate of turnover that they're seeing and just given the overall kind of funk people are in, that people will be less engaged. Does the data tell us why?
Well, I think one reason that people are more engaged compared to 20 years ago is because management strategies are changing. For a very long time, people said, just promote the best person in the job to become boss. And one of the problems with that is when you promote someone who's a technical expert, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the knowledge or the skills to become a great manager. So a lot more companies are taking the very skill of management seriously, and we can see that it pans out in the data. But to your point about what's happening now with the pandemic and who's leaving, the very intent to look for a job has not changed from 2019 to 2021. The reason we know that is because we annually ask people, are you actively looking for a job? And we find that 40% were in 2019 and 40% still are today.
And when you look at the data, what does it tell us about what an employee expects today versus, say, 5 or 10 years ago? Has that changed in terms of their expectations of what they want from an employer or what type of communications they expect from their employer?
Well, look, there are a lot of things that employees expect. I mean, money is a big expectation for employees everywhere. And I don't want to pretend that employee engagement is a panacea for massive pay increases. In fact, we find that if you offer on average a 20% increase, even to someone who's completely engaged in their job, they will look at that particular job. But again, that's not necessarily who's moving right now. In fact, we find among those that are actively disengaged in their job, it's 75% of them right now that are actively looking for new work. They seem to be the ones, including the ones that are not engaged, that are actually making this move because any increase in pay will cause them to leave that job.
And what's their gripe? Are they leaving because they feel like, why aren't they engaged? Why don't they feel an attachment? Is there underlying data that's, well, it's because of the communications, or they just don't like the company, they don't like the culture, a little bit of all?
There are a number of drivers, but there are kind of three that stick out right now. One is development. People looking for opportunities to develop, grow in their roles, or grow into a new role is critical for organizations. A second one is whether or not people feel attached to the mission or purpose of their organization. We find that only 33% of people really strongly agree to that question when we ask them, do you feel that strong attachment to the mission and purpose of the company? And the last one are the relationships at work. And I know that there are a lot of executives that might hear concepts like this and hate to talk about it, but it's true. In fact, there's even been a study, I think it was among 40 countries, where this organization actually looked and said, what are the single biggest drivers to whether or not an employee is satisfied in their job? And what they found that the biggest driver were the interpersonal relationships in a workplace. In fact, it was a bigger contributor than pay. So these are the emotional things that actually contribute to the stickiness as to whether or not somebody will leave or stay in a job.
This sort of work from everywhere or work from home phenomenon is relatively new. Do you have much data how that's affecting our expectations of an employer, or our expectations or shortfalls of communications?
Without question. Work from home is now becoming an expectation for a number of employees. In fact, there are about 2 in 10 employees that say, I'd like to work from home forever. There's another 3 in 10 that say, no, I'd primarily like to go into an office. The 5 in 10 that are in the middle say, no, I'd actually like to do both. So executives do need to be thinking about meeting the needs of employees around where they want to work. There was a separate study that said there are many people that would take up to a 30% pay cut in order to be able to remain working from home. So again, this is a massive consideration that if you want to maintain your stars, maintain your talent, you need to meet them where they are.
Jon, this is all very fascinating, and the data is so illuminating. When you think about Gallup, as we sort of wrap up, we think about your own employer. You look at the data. I hope and pray that you probably live by your own data. How have you changed? Like, how have you changed as a leader, or how has Gallup changed as an organization as this data has come in the door?
Well, I think one of the single best things that organizations can do is listen to their employees. So not only do we do surveys at a national level, but of course we do that within our own organization to try to make decision-making as participatory as possible. And I think some of the best organizations do that. As was reported in Axios this morning, Disney actually did a survey of their unions about whether or not they supported mandatory vaccinations. I think that was an excellent participatory process. Now, again, because 75% said that they did actually support making vaccines mandated, of course, that means 25% either said nothing or that they disagreed with it. But that participatory process is critical because we find that one of the key elements of engagement is whether or not people feel like their opinions count. And that's one of the single best ways to make sure that they count. And Gallup does that every day.
Jon, thank you for this fascinating conversation. For people watching at home, we have found Gallup to be a great partner when we're trying to study some of these topics, either journalistically or even for our own company, our own edification, so we can be a better employer. Jon is great. Gallup is great. And we really appreciate your time and your wisdom on this, Jon.
Jim, thank you for having me.